Welcome back to the frontier, travelers. Pull up a chair and turn up the volume because today's journey takes us to the far reaches of the galaxy, where love is rare and danger is constant. If you appreciate good stories and the old code of honor, hit that like button and subscribe. The universe had a nasty habit of cashing in its debts at the worst possible moments. For Rusty Vance, that moment was now. Red alert strobed across the cockpit of the Betsy, painting his rugged features in flashes of crimson. The ship, his only real home for 2 decades, groaned like a dying beast as another plasma bolt seared its aft plating. Outside, the blackness of the Kythera drift was swarming with the hornet-like silhouettes of bounty hunters' vessels. They were relentless, drawn to his scent like hounds to a wounded stag. "I'm detecting critical structural fatigue on decks 3 and 4, a dry female voice announced from the console. It was Betsy, the ship's AI, her tone dripping with the kind of long-suffering sarcasm only a machine that had spent years with a man like Rusty could perfect. You know, for a man who claims to value his privacy, you certainly attract a lot of unwanted attention. Perhaps you should consider a less provocative cologne." Rusty's hands were a blur across the control panel, his powerful forearms tense. He ignored the jibe, his eyes fixed on the rapidly shrinking window of escape. "How are the engines holding up, Bets?" "They're performing admirably considering you've been treating them like they owe you money," she retorted. "The primary capacitor is about to melt into a very expensive puddle of slag. We have 1 jump left, Rusty, and not enough power to calculate a safe corridor. A blind jump, the ultimate gamble, a spacefarer's last desperate prayer. It was suicide 9 times out of 10, but the 10th time was freedom." A grim smile touched Rusty's lips. He'd always liked those odds. He slammed a large, grease-stained lever forward, the console screaming in protest. A low hum began to build from deep within the ship's core, a rising chord of pure energy that vibrated through the steel deck and up into the soles of his worn leather boots. "Betsy," he said, his voice a low growl, "play me something for the road." There was a half-second of silence. Then the raw, mournful sound of an ancient electric guitar filled the cockpit, a wailing blues riff from a long-dead Earth musician, a song about a man at a crossroads with the devil at his heels. It was his ritual, his solace, the music of a man who knew he was already damned. "Spinning the wheel, you handsome fool," Betsy sighed. "Brace yourself. This is going to hurt." The universe folded in on itself. Stars stretched into streaks of impossible light, then collapsed into an abyss of non-existence. The jump was violent, a sledgehammer blow to reality. The Betsy shuddered, twisted, and was spat out on the other side like a piece of cosmic shrapnel. They emerged not into the silent void, but into the angry, swirling embrace of a planet's upper atmosphere, a world of rust-red clouds and furious winds. Alarms blared with a new, more terrified urgency. The ship was a falling stone, a coffin of burning metal. Rusty fought the controls, his muscles screaming with effort as he tried to pull the nose up. The ground rushed toward them, a landscape of jagged canyons and crimson sand, all of it seen through a spiderweb of cracks in the main viewport. The impact was an apocalypse of sound and force. Metal tore, systems exploded, and the mournful blues song was cut short by a final deafening silence. Then, darkness. Consciousness returned slowly, painfully, in a haze of red-tinted light. The air tasted of burnt wiring and alien dust. Rusty groaned, every inch of his body a symphony of pain. He pushed himself up, the shrapnel in his left shoulder grinding against bone. The cockpit was a ruin. Through the shattered viewport he saw a sky the color of dried blood, watched over by 2 pale, silent moons. "Betsy," he rasped, his throat raw. A shower of sparks answered from a mangled console. A weak, staticky voice crackled to life. "System. Failure. You, sir, are an absolute menace." Her voice faded out into a low, electronic groan. She was alive, but barely. He was stranded. He forced the buckled cockpit hatch open and half fell, half climbed out onto the alien soil. The ground was soft like fine red powder. The air was thin but breathable, carrying a strange metallic scent. The Betsy was a broken thing behind him, a trail of wreckage scarring the alien desert. He was alone, or so he thought. A sound made him turn, his hand instinctively reaching for the blaster that wasn't there, lost somewhere in the crash. On the ridge of a nearby dune, figures stood silhouetted against the twin moons. They weren't the bounty hunters. These were tall, robed beings holding long, ceremonial-looking staves that glinted in the dim light. They moved with a silent, deliberate grace, flowing down the dune toward him, their feet making no sound on the sand. They surrounded him, a circle of silent judgment. They didn't raise their weapons, they didn't have to. Their presence was enough. Rusty, injured and disarmed, slowly raised his hands. For the first time in a long time, he had played the odds and lost. The march to the temple was a silent, humbling ordeal. His captors, who he learned were called the Temple Guardians, communicated in hand gestures, their faces hidden in the shadows of their deep cowls. They led him through a winding canyon carved by ancient winds, the red rock walls towering over him like the bones of forgotten gods. After what felt like hours, the canyon opened up, and he saw it. It wasn't built so much as grown from the planet itself, a colossal temple of red stone that climbed toward the sky, its spires and buttresses looking like natural formations honed by a divine hand. It was ancient, imposing, and it radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was brought through massive gates into a cavernous hall where the air was cool and heavy with the scent of incense. He was forced to his knees in the center of the hall. Before him, on a simple, elevated stone throne, sat an old man. His robes were of the same rust-red cloth as the Guardians, but his were trimmed with silver thread. His face was a mask of stern, weathered lines, his eyes dark and piercing. This was Jorik, the High Priest. "You have defiled Erythos Prime, Outlander." Jorik's voice was not loud, but it filled the vast space echoing from the stone walls. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Our law is older than the stars in your sky. The penalty for your transgression is death." Rusty met the old man's gaze, his jaw tight with defiance. "My ship crashed. It was an accident. I meant no disrespect to your dirt." A flicker of something, not anger, but a cold, deep-set resolve, hardened Jorik's eyes. "Your intentions are irrelevant. Your presence is the crime. The law is the law." He raised a hand, and two guardians stepped forward, their staves now humming with a faint energy. "Wait," Rusty said, his mind racing. This wasn't a cantina brawl he could charm or fight his way out of. This was something else entirely. Ancient, inflexible. There has to be another way. I can pay. I can work. Jorik lowered his hand, a thoughtful, almost predatory look on his face. He studied Rusty, taking in his powerful build, the scars that mapped his arms, the unyielding fire in his eyes. He saw not a supplicant, but a survivor, a fighter, perhaps. The High Priest said slowly, his voice dropping. "The fates who brought you here are cruel, but not without a sense of irony. Our temple has suffered a great loss. The guardian of the sanctum, the sworn protector of our goddess Nixala, was taken by the Cathar beasts 3 cycles ago." He gestured vaguely toward the darkness behind his throne. "The position is empty, a position of great honor and great sacrifice." He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Rusty. "The law demands a life, but it does not specify how that life must be given. I will offer you a choice, Outlander. The swift release of death here and now, or one full cycle of this world, 1 year by your reckoning, in service to this temple. You will take the fallen guardian's place. You will protect the goddess with your life. You will be a prisoner within these sacred walls, bound by an oath of honor. If you serve faithfully and survive the year, your debt will be paid. We will repair your vessel, and you will be free to leave." Rusty looked at the energized staves of the guards, then back at the unreadable face of the High Priest. Death, or a cage, a quick end, or a long, slow servitude on a forgotten world. But it was a chance, and a man like Rusty Vance never turned down a chance, no matter how slim. "I accept," he growled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Jorik nodded, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. "So be it. Your life now belongs to the temple." The guards pulled him to his feet and led him away from the main hall, deeper into the heart of the colossal structure. They walked through silent corridors and across vast, empty courtyards bathed in the pale light of the twin moons. Finally, they stopped before a set of towering gates carved from the same red stone, inlaid with veins of a lustrous black mineral. With a deep, grinding groan that echoed like a final judgment, the gates swung open. The guards shoved him through, and the gates began to close behind him, the sound of their meeting a thunderous boom that sealed his new reality. He was alone in a vast, open-air garden, a sanctuary of impossible beauty and profound silence. Across a placid, star-reflecting pool, he saw a figure standing beneath a weeping alien tree. It was a woman. She was tall and slender, her skin the color of a pale lilac twilight, marked with delicate, swirling lines of silver that shimmered faintly. Her ears were long and tapered, and her silver hair cascaded down her back. She was wrapped in simple, flowing white robes. She didn't turn or acknowledge his presence, but he could feel the weight of her sorrow from across the courtyard. This was Nixala, his charge, his goddess, his jailer. She looked less like a deity and more like the loneliest soul in the galaxy, a prisoner in her own gilded cage. And now, he was trapped in it with her. The first cycle was a lesson in silence. Days bled into nights marked only by the slow, stately passage of the twin moons across the crimson sky. Rusty's world, once as vast as the galactic spiral, had shrunk to the polished stone corridors and manicured gardens of the temple. His duty was simple, monotonous, and absolute. He was a shadow, a sentinel. He patrolled the outer walls at dawn, stood guard in the great hall at midday, and watched over the entrance to Nixala's private sanctuary through the long, silent nights. He was a ghost in this hollow kingdom of faith. He performed his duties with the grim efficiency of a man who understood his role. He was a tool, a placeholder, a life bartered for a year's time. The priests, led by the ever-watchful Jorik, treated him with a cold, detached respect. They saw the warrior in him, the coiled potential for violence, and they kept their distance. They would bring him his meals, simple trays of strange, nutritious vegetation and roasted meat from some local fauna, and leave them on a stone bench, never speaking a word. He was the savage they kept on a leash, a necessary evil to protect their sacred charge. And Nixala, she was even more distant than the stars he could no longer reach. He saw her every day, a fleeting vision of lilac and silver. She would glide through her gardens, her bare feet making no sound on the mossy paths. She would meditate for hours by the placid pool, her reflection the only company she seemed to tolerate. She never looked at him. She never spoke. Her silence was a wall of glass, a barrier more formidable than any temple gate. To her, he was merely a part of the architecture, another silent statue in her lonely domain. The solitude began to chew at him. In the infinite blackness between worlds, a man could be alone, but he was never lonely. The hum of the Betsy, the promise of the next port, the freedom of the next jump, that was company enough. Here, the silence was an entity. It pressed in, filled his lungs, and echoed the emptiness carved out by his own past, by the broken promise that had set him on this path in the first place. He started to feel the cage. Its bars weren't made of steel, but of ritual, silence, and the crushing weight of a year that stretched out before him like a barren desert. After the 93rd cycle, he broke. It wasn't a violent outburst or a desperate escape attempt. It was quieter, more profound. During his long night watch, sitting on the cold steps outside her sanctuary, he unclipped the small, battered music player from his belt. It was one of the few personal effects he'd managed to salvage from the wreck. He plugged in a worn set of earbuds, but the silence of the temple felt too absolute to be contained by such a small gesture. He hesitated for a moment, then unplugged them and set the player on the stone beside him. He turned the volume just high enough for him to hear. The raw, distorted wail of a slide guitar cut through the sacred quiet. It was an old recording, thick with static, a song from the 20th century about a man selling his soul. The singer's voice was gravel and cheap whiskey, a lament of regret and defiance that had crossed centuries and star systems to find a home in this alien temple. The music was his only link to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was an act of rebellion, an act of survival. He saw a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. From behind a screen of hanging vines that veiled the entrance to her sanctuary, Nixala was watching him. He couldn't see her face clearly, only her silhouette against the soft inner light, but he could feel her attention. It was the first time she had acknowledged his existence as anything more than a piece of furniture. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there listening to the strange, sorrowful sounds of his forgotten world, until the song faded back into the oppressive silence. Then she was gone. The music became their unspoken ritual. Every night he would play a single song, a blues lament, a raw rock anthem, a soulful ballad, and every night she would listen from the shadows. The wall of glass between them remained, but now it had a crack, a single hairline fracture through which something new was beginning to seep. The attack came without warning during the sweltering heat of the afternoon. A guttural roar echoed from beyond the outer walls, a sound of pure, mindless savagery that was utterly alien to the temple's serene atmosphere. Rusty was on his feet in an instant, his body thrumming with an instinct he had suppressed for months. An alarm, a deep, resonant gong began to sound through the temple. Priests ran in a state of controlled panic, their faces pale. "The Cathar!" one of them yelled, his voice tight with fear. "They've breached the first gate." Rusty didn't wait for orders. He grabbed a heavy, iron-tipped ceremonial spear from a wall display. It was poorly balanced but better than nothing, and sprinted towards the sound of the commotion. He emerged into the main courtyard to a scene of chaos. Hulking, ape-like beasts with matted reddish fur and multiple sets of glowing malevolent eyes were pouring through a shattered section of the outer wall. They were the Cathar, brutes armed with crude axes and a primal fury, their claws gouging deep furrows in the sacred stones. The temple guardians, for all their stoic posturing, were no match for them. Their movements were ritualized, defensive. They were keepers, not warriors. The Cathar were a tide of violence, and they were overwhelming them. Rusty didn't hesitate. He let out a roar of his own, a battle cry that was pure, distilled rage, and charged into the fray. The first Cathar that turned to face him was met with the iron spearhead through its throat. He ripped the weapon free and used the butt end to shatter the jaw of another. This was his element. The chaos, the violence, the dance of life and death. It was as natural to him as breathing. He was no longer a sentinel. He was a storm. The priests and guardians stared in awe and horror as the quiet outlander transformed into a whirlwind of brutal, efficient destruction. He moved with a grace that belied his size, his fists and the borrowed spear a blur of motion. He fought his way across the courtyard, his objective clear in his mind. Nixala. He saw her then. She had been brought out of her sanctuary by Yorick, as per their ritual, to a supposedly secure balcony overlooking the courtyard. But a massive Cathar, larger than the others, had scaled the wall and was now lumbering towards her. Yorick and the other priests stood frozen, their faith a useless shield against the creature's primal rage. Time seemed to slow. Rusty saw the beast raise a massive, clawed hand to strike. He saw Nixala's wide, terrified eyes. He pushed off the ground, vaulting over a decorative fountain and threw the heavy spear with all his might. It flew true, burying itself deep in the Cathar's shoulder. The beast roared in pain and fury, turning its attention from Nixala to him. It ripped the spear out and charged, its glowing eyes burning with hate. Rusty met the charge head-on. He ducked under a wild swing that would have decapitated him and drove his fist into the creature's gut. It was like punching a stone wall. The beast swatted him away, sending him crashing into the balcony railing. His head spun, the taste of blood in his mouth. The Cathar loomed over him, its foul breath washing over his face, its claws poised for the final blow. With a final surge of adrenaline, Rusty grabbed a loose, heavy stone baluster from the broken railing and swung it upwards with everything he had. Connecting squarely with the creature's skull, there was a sickening crunch of bone, and the massive beast collapsed, its light dimming from its many eyes. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by the groans of the wounded and Rusty's own ragged breathing. He was on one knee, his body bruised and bleeding, the heavy stone still clutched in his hand. He had saved them. He had done his duty. He slowly got to his feet and turned to face the goddess he was sworn to protect. Nixala was no longer on the balcony. She was standing just a few feet away from him on the blood-soaked stones. She had come down. She had broken protocol. The priests, even Yorick, looked on in stunned silence. Her lilac skin was pale, her silver hair disheveled, but her eyes were fixed on him. They held no divinity, no detachment. They held fear, awe, and something else, something deeply human. She took a step closer, her gaze dropping to a deep gash on his forearm, where the Cathar's claws had torn through his leather vest. She reached out a slender, trembling hand, not to thank him, not to bless him, but to hover her fingers just over the wound, as if mesmerized by the sight of his red blood. Her voice, when it came, was not the ethereal chime he might have imagined. It was soft, with a husky, melodic timbre, and it cut through the silence more effectively than any alarm gong. "They never told me," she whispered, her eyes lifting to meet his, "that a guardian could bleed." The battle shattered the temple's sacred silence, and in its place, something new and fragile began to grow. The wall of glass between Rusty and Nixala had not just cracked, It had been pulverized. The dynamic of goddess and guardian, of prisoner and jailer, was washed away in the tide of violence and blood. Now they were simply a man and a woman, isolated together at the edge of a forgotten world. In the days that followed, the priests, led by a humbled and visibly shaken Jorik, afforded Rusty a new level of respect. Their cold detachment was replaced by nods of acknowledgement, their fear supplanted by a grudging admiration. They tended to his wounds with gentle hands, their movements precise and reverent. They had seen the savage, but they had also seen the protector. They finally understood that the chain they held was attached not to a mindless beast, but to a lion. But it was Nixala who changed the most. The mask of divine indifference was gone, replaced by a raw, open curiosity. She began to seek him out, not with words at first, but with her presence. During his patrols, he would find her sitting in a distant alcove, her large, luminous eyes following him as he walked the temple walls. She left a small silken cloth and a bowl of potent healing salve near his post one morning. It was an offering, a gesture of care that spoke volumes more than any formal thanks. The first real conversation happened a week after the attack, during his night watch. He was sitting on his usual steps, the aches in his body a dull, constant reminder of the fight. He hadn't played his music since that day, feeling it an intrusion on the temple's newfound solemnity. The silence stretched, deep and familiar, until her soft voice cut through it. "You are not playing your songs." He turned. She was standing in the archway of her sanctuary, not hidden in the shadows this time, but fully visible in the pale light of the twin moons. She had shed her formal white robes for a simple lilac-colored shift that clung to her slender form. Rusty felt a knot in his chest loosen, didn't think it was appropriate. He gestured vaguely to the courtyard, where the scars of the battle were still visible on the ancient stones. "It is," she said, taking a tentative step out into the garden. "The silence is louder now. I miss the sound of your world." He picked up the small player, his rough, calloused fingers tracing its battered casing. "It's not much of a world, just old ghosts singing about old pains." "Tell me about them," she said, her voice a quiet plea. She sat down on a stone bench opposite him, a respectable distance between them, but the space felt charged, intimate. "Tell me about the ghosts, and the stars you came from." And so he did, hesitantly at first, then with a growing ease. He told her about the vast chaotic galaxy beyond Erythos Prime. He spoke of crowded spaceports that smelled of ozone and spiced meats, of the hum of a hyperspace jump, of the freedom of charting a course with no destination in mind. He told her about the blues, about music born from suffering that could make a lonely man feel understood across a gulf of centuries. And as the twin moons arced across the sky, he found himself speaking of the one thing he never spoke of, the broken promise. He didn't give her the details, the name, the face, the failure, but he spoke of the weight of it, of a vow he had made and failed to keep, a failure that had cost someone dearly, and sent him running to the farthest, darkest corners of the universe. She listened, her head tilted, her luminous eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, his voice rough with unshed emotion, she did not offer pity or judgment. She simply nodded, a deep and profound understanding in her gaze. Then she shared her own prison. "My people believe I am a goddess," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "They call it the blessing of Erythos. I can feel the planet, the shifting of the deep rock, the thirst of the sand, the life in the hidden grottos. It is a constant hum inside my mind, a connection that has been passed down my lineage for 1,000 generations." She looked up at the moons, her expression deeply sad. "But this blessing is a wall. It sets me apart. I can feel the soul of my world, but I cannot feel the touch of another person without being overwhelmed. My people worship me from a distance. They bring me gifts. They sing my praises, but they do not see me. They see a symbol. I have been alone in a crowd my entire life." In that moment, Rusty saw the truth of it. He was a prisoner for a year. She was a prisoner for life. They were two solitary souls trapped in cages of their own making, finding a strange and unexpected reflection in each other. Their nightly talks became the anchor of his existence. The routine of guard duty was no longer a sentence, but a prelude to the few precious hours they could steal for themselves. The garden, once a symbol of his confinement, became their sanctuary. Laughter, a sound he was sure the temple had never heard, began to echo softly among the alien flora. He taught her the lyrics to an old rock song, and she, in turn, showed him how to read the constellations in her sky. The attraction between them was a slow burn, an undeniable gravity pulling them closer. It was in the way her gaze lingered on his hands when he repaired a broken stone on the wall, and in the way his breath would catch when a stray breeze pressed her simple dress against her body. It was a dangerous, forbidden current flowing beneath the surface of their quiet conversations. One night, a sudden cold rain began to fall. They took shelter in a small, forgotten alcove behind a curtain of weeping moss. The space was small, forcing them closer than they had ever been. He could smell the faint, sweet scent of her skin, like night-blooming flowers and clean ozone. He could see the silver markings on her face shimmer with each drop of moisture. "Rusty," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Whether from the cold or something else, he couldn't tell. She had learned his name from his own stories. She was the only one in this world who used it. He looked down at her. Her face was tilted up towards his, her lips slightly parted. The vast, lonely universe seemed to contract to this single point, this tiny space filled with the sound of the rain and their own breathing. He knew the rules. He knew his place. He was a guardian, an outlander, a temporary fixture in her life. Touching her was a line he should not cross, but he was tired of rules, tired of running, tired of being alone. Slowly, as if asking permission, he raised a hand and gently brushed a stray, silver strand of hair from her cheek. His rough, scarred fingers were a stark contrast to her smooth, lilac skin. The touch was electric. A gasp escaped her lips and her eyes fluttered shut. It wasn't the overwhelming psychic backlash she had described. With him, it was different. It was just a touch. He leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs, and captured her lips with his. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in a language older than words. Then she responded, her hands coming up to grip his muscular arms, pulling him closer. All the pent-up loneliness, the silent yearning of the past months, poured into that single, desperate act. It was a kiss of shared solitude, a rebellion against their gilded cages. Their romance became a secret fire in the heart of the temple, a warmth against the cold stone and colder duty. They stole moments in hidden gardens and shadowed corridors, their relationship a dangerous and beautiful secret. They knew, with a painful certainty, that their time was a countdown. Every sunset, every moonrise, brought his departure one day closer. The knowledge didn't diminish their passion, it intensified it, making every touch, every whispered word, every shared glance, infinitely precious. He was no longer just serving a sentence. He was living, truly living, for the first time in years. But he also knew that the same honor that had bound him to this place would be the very thing that would eventually force him to leave it. And her, behind. The last dawn on Erythos Prime broke like a healing wound across the horizon. The sky bled shades of soft crimson and bruised purple, casting long, somber shadows from the ancient spires of the temple. Rusty stood before the Betsy, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn leather vest. The year was over. His ship was whole again. The priests, with a surprising and meticulous skill, had repaired the damage. The scarred hull plating was replaced, the engine capacitors recharged, the shattered viewport now a seamless sheet of reinforced plasteel. She gleamed under the alien sun, a promise of freedom, a vessel ready to carry him back to the familiar lonely black. A year ago, this was all he had wanted. Now the sight of it left a hollow ache in his chest. "All systems are green," Betsy's voice chimed from the ship's external comms, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. "Whole integrity at 100%. The locals did a decent job. For primitives." Rusty grunted, his eyes drifting back towards the temple gates. "They're not primitives, Bets. Forgive me," she deadpanned. "I meant to say metallurgically gifted ascetics. Are we going to stand here admiring their work all day? Or are you planning on leaving before your warranty expires?" He was spared from answering by the sound of footsteps on the stone path. Jorik approached, his hands clasped within the sleeves of his formal robes. He stopped a few feet from Rusty, his old dark eyes appraising the Outlander one last time. "The cycle is complete," the high priest stated, his voice a low rumble. "You have served with honor, Rusty Vance. You have bled for this temple. The law is satisfied. Your debt is paid." Rusty met his gaze and gave a short, respectful nod. "The deal was a year of my life for my ship. A deal's a deal. You gave us more than a year," Jorik countered, a flicker of profound respect in his expression. "You gave us a future. You are a man of violence. a storm from the stars. But you are also a man of your word. The two are rarely found in the same vessel. He made a slight formal bow. You are free. Go in peace. Jorik turned and walked back toward the temple, leaving Rusty alone with his ship and his choice. He took a step towards the boarding ramp, the metal cool and solid beneath his boot. Freedom. He could be light years away from here in hours, lose himself in the asteroid fields of the Viridian Gulch, find a cantina, a bottle, and forget the scent of lilac and the feel of silver hair under his fingertips. He could go back to running. Rusty. Her voice was a whisper on the wind. He turned. Nixala stood in the great archway of the temple gate, a solitary figure framed by the ancient stone. She wasn't dressed as a goddess. She wore the simple shift she'd worn during their stolen nights in the garden. She looked fragile, human, and devastatingly beautiful. He walked to her, every step a hammer blow to his own heart. They stopped, a chasm of unspoken words and impossible futures between them. So this is it, he said, his voice rougher than usual. She nodded, her luminous eyes welling with a sorrow that mirrored his own. You have kept your promise. You are a man of honor. Honor, he scoffed, the word tasting like poison. Honor is what's making me leave. And it is what made you worth knowing, she replied, her voice soft but firm. She reached out, not to touch him, but to gently graze the sleeve of his vest. Out there, in the stars, will you remember the color of our sky? Always, he said, his voice thick. He wanted to pull her to him, to say to hell with honor and promises, to burn this world down if it meant he could stay. But he couldn't. She was the heart of this planet, and he was a phantom passing through. To stay would be to cage her, and to cage himself. He took a step back, the hardest thing he had ever done. Take care of yourself, Nixala. And you, Rusty Vance, she whispered. He turned his back on her and walked towards the Betsy, not daring to look back, because he knew if he did, he would never leave. He was halfway up the boarding ramp when the ground trembled. A low, guttural roar, deeper and more resonant than before, rolled across the plains, not from one direction, but from all of them. It was the sound of an army. He spun around. Nixala's face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen before. She was looking past him to the horizon. Rusty followed her gaze. A red dust cloud was rising, a churning wave of destruction that stretched from one end of the canyon to the other, and within it, thousands of glowing eyes. A horde. The Cathar had returned, not as a raiding party, but as an invasion. Rusty, go, Nixala screamed, her voice cutting through the rising din. You are free. Your oath is fulfilled. Go. The boarding ramp was still open. The Betsy's engines were humming, ready. Freedom was 2 steps away. Logic, survival, every instinct he had honed over a lifetime of running, told him to get in, seal the door, and punch a hole in the sky. But he looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also a defiant resolve as she stood her ground before the home she was sworn to. He thought of his broken promise, the ghost that had haunted him across the galaxy, the failure of a man who had run when he should have stood and fought. He would not be that man again. Not today. With a curse that was half prayer, half fury, he slammed his fist on the ramp's control panel. The ramp hissed shut, sealing him out of his own ship, sealing his fate. He drew the heavy custom blaster Jorik had gifted him, a sign of respect after the first battle, and walked back to stand beside her. She stared at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and a dawning, heartbreaking hope. What are you doing? He gave her a grim, crooked smile, the kind of smile a man gives when he's staring into the abyss. A year. That was the deal. The day's not over yet. The horde crashed against the temple walls like a monstrous wave. The battle was a blur of primal fury and desperate courage. Rusty fought like a man possessed, his blaster carving paths through the tide of beasts, his fists and a discarded war hammer breaking bodies and bone. He was no longer just a guardian. He was an embodiment of defiance. But for every Cathar he cut down, 3 more took its place. He fought his way to the top of the main gate, firing into the thickest parts of the horde below. The priests and guardians fought bravely, but they were being overwhelmed. The line was breaking. This was the end. Suddenly, a strange, low hum filled the air. He looked over and saw Nixala, standing on the highest balcony, her eyes closed, her arms outstretched. The silver markings on her skin were glowing with a brilliant white light. The very stones of the temple seemed to vibrate in sympathy with her. A wave of pure psychic energy, visible as a shimmer in the air, erupted from her, washing over the battlefield. The Cathar screamed, a sound of agony and terror, clutching their heads as the invisible force slammed into their primitive minds. They faltered, their charge breaking, their savagery turning to panicked confusion. It was the opening they needed. Roaring, Rusty led the Guardians in a countercharge, cutting deep into the now disoriented enemy. They fought back to back, a goddess and a gunslinger, a perfect, deadly unison of alien power and human grit. They were victorious, but the cost was etched into the broken walls and the silent bodies of priests and beasts alike. As the last of the Cathar fled into the desert and exhausted silence fell, Rusty stood in the center of the devastated courtyard, breathing heavily, his body a canvas of new cuts and bruises. Nixala stood before him, the divine light fading from her skin, leaving her looking weary, mortal. The sun was beginning to set, painting the scene of carnage in hues of gold and blood. The day was over. His promise was, finally and truly, fulfilled. There were no more words to say. Everything had been said in the fury of the battle, in the choice to stay, in the shared fight for survival. He holstered his blaster and walked towards his ship. The ramp lowered to meet him. He stopped at the base of it and looked back at her one last time. She stood amidst the ruin, her home saved, her people safe. She was a queen on a battlefield of her own making. She gave him a small, sad nod. It was a thank you. It was a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement of a love that could never be. He nodded back, turned, and walked up the ramp without looking back again. The hatch sealed, shutting out the red sky of Erythos Prime. He slumped into the captain's chair, the familiar smell of worn leather and engine oil a cold comfort. Course laid in, Betsy's voice said gently from the console. Destination, anywhere but here. He engaged the engines. The Betsy lifted off, rising above the temple, above the canyons and into the thinning crimson atmosphere. On the main viewer, he saw a single small figure in the courtyard, watching him ascend, until it was just a speck, and then nothing at all. He pushed the throttle forward and the stars welcomed him back into their cold, lonely embrace. He was free, but the cage he had left behind had held his heart, and now he carried its memory with him, a new scar, deeper than any blade could make, an honorable wound. True honor isn't found in keeping a promise, but in choosing to stand your ground when you are finally free to run. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.